Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for the launch of the 2020 Harvest Seminars. I am Priya Rao. I am the Head of Inclusion at Femmes du Vin, and I'm so honored to be moderating this session, and it's just such a pleasure to be here and to see all the people who have joined us so far and will continue to join us over this next hour and a half, I'm sure. For the attendees, thank you. All the funds that we have raised throughout these seminars and will continue to raise will go towards our scholarships. So you are making a huge difference to help support women in wine around the world. I would also like to thank our sponsor of this session, which is Wines of South Africa. We are so happy to have you on board with this panel. We've got the hashtags up here, so please, if you're tweeting or doing any kind of social media throughout the event, these are the hashtags, and also make sure to tag us at Femmes du Vin, and we will be retweeting, reposting everything that you put out there. Now at Femmes du Vin, we are all about women who are playing a great active role in the wine industry. We feel strongly about ensuring that all women around the world, regardless of any barriers, are able to be part of that wave. And that's why we've chosen the topic of diversity and inclusion to be our very first kickoff seminar. It is of utmost importance to us here. The conversations that have happened in the world over the last few months have only strengthened our commitment to that goal. So we are really honored to be kicking off this series with such an important topic. We're going to have a 60-minute discussion with our panelists, who I will be introducing very shortly. And followed by that, we'll have about a half an hour of Q&A where all of you can post your questions in the little chat box you'll see at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A chat box there. Throw your questions in there, and those will be filtered to me for the last 30 minutes of this seminar. So we're going to talk a lot about various forms of discrimination and barriers based on both visible and invisible factors such as religion, ethnicity, skin color, physical disability, or other things like accents and socioeconomic background. We're going to look at the state of the industry, what's changing, what isn't, and some of the types of initiatives in place to help bring all women into the conversation and into a diverse set of jobs within the wine industry. And then, of course, we're going to end off on a positive note of looking at ways in which we can all be part of the solution. There was a quote that one of our panelists, Julia Coney, said when we were chatting that I think is important, and I'm going to put this right out front and center. She said, "The conversations are going to be tough, and we all need grace." So I hope you'll think of that as we engage in this very important and very controversial at times topic. It is an honor to introduce this esteemed panel of women. And the aforementioned Julia Coney is a wine writer, wine educator, speaker, and consultant whose work has been featured in the New York Times, Wine Enthusiast, Forbes.com, and JancisRobinson.com, among many others. She holds a WSET Level 2 in Wine and Spirits and is currently pursuing her Master Level Champagne certification. I know she has a soft spot for bubbles, with the Wine Scholar Guild and WSET Level 3 certification. She is also the founder of Black Wine Professionals, whose goal is to, yes, lift up the multifaceted Black professionals in the world of wine, and her writing includes the intersection of race, wine, and language, which is another important thing we're going to touch upon. That is language. Welcome, Julia. Our second panelist is Ntsiki Biyela. She was awarded a scholarship to study winemaking in 1999 in South Africa. She graduated in 2003 and joined boutique winery Stella Kaya Wines the following year, making history by becoming the first Black female winemaker in South Africa. Starting Eslina Wines in 2014 was the realization of a dream for Ntsiki, and she has been creating award-winning wines and has become a winemaking trailblazer in the South African wine sphere. Thank you for joining us, Ntsiki. Back here in the Americas, June Rodil is a master sommelier based in Texas and only one of 28 women in the Americas to hold that title. In her career, she's opened over a dozen hospitality concepts with numerous James Beard Award winners and nominees, as well as several Food and Wine magazine's Best New Chefs. Her accolades include, and the list is so long, but I'm going to summarize them: Wine Enthusiast Somm of the Year 2018, Wine Enthusiast 40 Under 14 in 2016, Food and Wine Magazine's Sommelier of the Year 2014, Star Chef's Rising Star Sommelier 2012, Wine and Spirits Best New Sommelier 2011, and TechSomm Best Sommelier winner of 2009. If I tried to do that all in one breath, I wouldn't have made it through. And finally, over in the UK, we have Jancis Robinson. In 2018, she was voted the world's most influential wine critic in various polls around the world. She writes for her own site, jancisrobinson.com, as well as for the Financial Times. She is founder and editor of the Oxford Companion to Wine, which is co-authored by Hugh Johnson of the World Atlas of Wine, And in 1984, she was the first person outside the wine trade to pass the rigorous MW, Master of Wine exams. Welcome to all of you ladies. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I was recently reading an article about Sonal Holland, who is the first MW in India. She was the first Indian to be accepted into the Master of Wine program back in 2016 or the late 20-teens. It was interesting reading about her journey because she spoke about a lot of the topics that we're going to discuss today. Some of which is that when we look at why maybe the wine world has been so white, it's part of it is because many of us are raised in cultures and backgrounds where wine was not part of our everyday life. So there's been a lack of exposure. I know that that has been something, Julia, that you've talked about in terms of just the Black communities and how they're not exposed to wine as a regular thing in their everyday lives. Do you want to just touch upon what your journey was like? Because you became a wine lover before you became a part of the wine industry. And what that journey was like for you to transition from somebody who just appreciated wine and was at the bar talking to the somms serving her, to when you became somebody who was on the other side serving the guests.
Well, for me, you say June or Julia?
Julia, sorry.
Okay. So, I started really loving wine in my 20s. My family doesn't drink, and I think they just don't have a problem. I just didn't grow up with alcohol. Like, they don't drink anything. It was like juice and soda at the table and water. That was your choices. And so for me, learning about wine came in my late 20s from an attorney I work with, who just happens to still be a friend of mine. And I think I was just so curious that he just took me under his wing and just guided me. But at that time, I was just fascinated with how like wine and food went together. And pivoting and fast forward, 20 years later, and I decided to write about wine after leaving a legal career, then a beauty career. I decided that I thought wine was so communal and it was fun, but I found like the barrier to entry was just different, because people were shocked that I was a Black woman who had traveled all over the world. My vacations included going to Bordeaux and different parts of the world to just taste wine. The industry wasn't used to someone like that, which is fine. But for me, it was still a shock. And sometimes I'm still shocked at things that people, do and say, but I am here for the long haul. Like, I'm not going anywhere. Like, people need to get, used to that. And that's one of the reasons, like, I think with what has been happening over the past couple of months is extraordinary how we're looking at diversity in such a global way regarding, like you said, ageism, race, language, culture, all that.
Pardon me, the unmuting. There are so many factors of, being a woman in the wine industry is something that we all have in common, all the people who are listening here. Well, possibly there are some participants that are males, and you're welcome to the table too, but we're adding on all these layers of other factors that are just compounding our road to success, whatever that may be, as a wine writer, as a somm, as a wine agent, as a server in a restaurant, or as a winemaker. Now, Ntsiki, for you, you've talked about your journey and how when you first went to university to study wine, that some of your fellow students had certain comments about you that you felt you weren't welcome and part of the community. Can you talk about what that experience was like for you in South Africa?
Thank you very much, Priya. I think for me, getting into the university and trying to learn in a language that I did not understand on its own was a challenge. Being in an environment that looked completely different from what I know, it was a challenge. But to top it up, when basically, even in class, when the lecturer will be lecturing in Afrikaans and they try to switch to English and the students will make noise, or on top of that, will be asked, like, why did you come to an Afrikaans university if you don't understand the language? You know, it was one of those things that it makes you feel like, okay, you don't belong here. It's like there's these unsaid words, but whatever comes up front, it's like, why are you here? So it was basically one of the things I think that made some of other students left the university. Some of the Black students who didn't understand the language, like me, they were like, you know what, we don't belong here. And basically they left the university. But I think because I knew what I wanted to do, I had to try and push through that.
And how did you push through that? Because that's a barrier that's difficult. If that is their language of instruction, how did you continue your studies when they were primarily teaching in a language that you didn't quite understand?
So we had to ask to get extra classes, get tutors. So you attend the class and then you have an extra class. But also on top of that complication, because of the environment, a lot of pressure that comes down to you as a person. I had to go to therapy to try and actually relieve the whole stress thing and just explain, this is so hard for me. And talking to therapy and saying that to them, you know what, I know I'm going to fail first because I don't understand. It's hard. It's not, everything here is complicated for me. And so just to try and see if I could get a backup to say, okay, if let's say things don't work out the way I want it to be, because the university might kick me out if I don't pass my first year. So to get that backup, it actually helped me and release the stress so that I could focus and study.
Mm-hmm. Did some of your fellow Black classmates fall out of the program because they didn't have the resolve or the strength to put up with that type of constant, pressure?
Yeah, no, some of the students dropped out. Some of the students dropped out because it was just, I can say it was too much. When I look at it now, I realize it was too much pressure. And especially looking that it's not just the language, it's the whole culture. The whole culture. I'm from a rural village, like literally, I didn't grow up in the city. So it's the whole experience of being in an environment, in a city, everything is fast, and you are in a place where culturally you don't fit in that culture. So you have to learn a lot of things. And on top of that, you've got the language barrier. So it was just a lot of layers that I needed to peel to be able to get to a space where I can say, okay, I'm trying better now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
June, let's talk to you for a second. Now, in North America or in the States, you obviously didn't have a language barrier in your studies. However, you do have a different barrier in terms of not being Caucasian. And what was that like for you as you were sitting for your MW exam or even your SOM exams? Did you notice during your journey that there were more and more people who were not the norm, not the average white person in the class, or even all the way through? Was it primarily that you felt like you were one of just a handful of the non-whites in the room?
I've always felt like one of just a handful of non-whites still to this day. And it gets way more narrow as you move up through the certifications as well. So it's definitely one of those things where it's hard to normalize that you are one of the few. And then it becomes a new thing to normalize and embrace more and try to figure out how to find more people who look like you or look different than an average white male. So you definitely, because there's a larger room of people whenever you start in your introductory level, find more women, find more minorities. But as you move through the certification process, it definitely diminishes as you move further up, which is, I think, the I think, the norm in not just our industry, but in many industries as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to mention before I go to Jancis that you were very keen at Jancis. We asked you to be part of a couple of different seminars on for this series, and you wanted to be part of the diversity discussion. So I'd like to ask you, because in our pre-conference call, you mentioned that you didn't realize how white the wine world was until just a couple of years ago. So in this panel, where for everybody else, it's a constant, it's just every day they notice themselves being different and how the industry that they're in doesn't really accept them. I'd love to hear what that realization was like for you and how it came about.
Well, it was actually 3 years ago. I became aware that there was this interesting little group of Zimbabwean the top somms in South Africa were all Zimbabwean and wanted to get together a team for the World Wine Tasting Championships, a Zimbabwean team. And somebody wrote a lovely story about them for jancisrobinson.com. And I thought, this is a great story. Somebody ought to make a movie about it. And I contacted the people that I could think of who might be interested. And eventually an Australian production crew have made a lovely movie about it, which will debut any moment. And I had to go to the World Wine Tasting Championships in Burgundy and be interviewed about them. And really, it was only, I tell you one thing, there was a great feeling of warmth in this, it was like an Olympics, a wine tasting Olympics, and the whole room absolutely loved them, not least because they would do a cappella, before they started and things like that. And I loved them, and I hadn't met them before. But it actually, that I'm ashamed to say, that was really, when being interviewed about them, I just felt myself saying, the world of wine that I've grown up in since 1975 is just so irrevocably white. I'm ashamed, and it was a real realization. And since then, I've tried to do various things to improve that situation. But I do find that among the people I know here in the British wine trade, once you start to raise the issue, unless they're just out and out bigots and whatever, they, oh, I'd never thought about that. That's terrible. I mean, it's a lack of conscience rather than a lack of will in most cases.
And that is, I think, where Julia's statement about the conversations are going to be tough and we all need to have grace is, again, very pertinent, because sometimes we, as the people who are experiencing discrimination on a daily basis, or not necessarily discrimination, but just realizing themselves as being the other, we might consider, well, how could you not know? Or, sometimes there does tend to be that little chip on the shoulder that comes up of, you must be a bigot or a racist, because how could you not see that this is true? Julia, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think inherently, like if you did, like I grew up on a street that was all different races, ethnicities, but everyone wasn't that fortunate. That was in Houston, Texas. And I mean, we're talking the 70s and 80s. My block had Asian families. So it was like, oh, I'm getting some kimchi today. That wasn't foreign to me, but it's foreign to a lot of people because their purview is just what they actually look like. So I always try now to, when I have these discussions, to tell everybody to go and check your social media feed and see who you follow. If your feed is not as diverse as you want it to be, maybe find people to follow. And that's a first step. But I have been, like Jancis was saying, some people just don't know. They just were like, oh, I didn't know this was a problem. That is true. But then you have the others, like she said, who are just outright bigots. And that's fine. You can keep staying in your lane over there as well. We're trying to change the world over here. But I think coming from being Black in the industry, you can not really understand, or you don't have empathy or sympathy, but you don't have to be rude about it. I mean, when a gentleman told me in 2017, because I had on a black suit at a master class, that I looked like the help. This is 2017 at a master class where everyone is tasting wine because I had on a black suit, and I'm thinking, why wouldn't I wear a black suit? We're tasting Italian reds. I'm not going to wear a white suit in November. So it's things like that, those kind of expectations is you looking at people of color as only being part of service. Mm-hmm. They're not part of the leaders, or they're not part of the ones who are sitting at the table to decide, can I put that wine in a store? Can I put it on a list? I think that is changing, but it is because we're pushing this through with having panels like this and talking about our own, because a lot of times when we say bias, we have to go, what is my bias and why am I biased according to this? What problems do I have? So it's very looking inward, and to understand, that's why I say give everybody grace, because if you're just having this epiphany moment in the last 3 months, that's okay too. Mm-hmm. So, but also it's a marathon, not a sprint.
And I know, Julia, you've also spoken about how because your name is Julia, and let's just say, this is one of those invisible barriers, Julia could be an anybody, whereas a Ntsiki, people may already assume that she is not Caucasian. But you have spoken about once you'd have conversations on the phone or online, and then once the person met you in face-to-face, sometimes the attitude would change because they're seeing now in front of them a Black woman. I'm curious, June, if you have experienced similar instances of talking to wine agents maybe for your restaurants or other suppliers or even guests and who come in, and once they see you face to face, if their attitude towards you changes and how you deal with that.
Yes, absolutely. I do want to say one thing though, in regards to what Julia was saying regarding grace and being uncomfortable, like this, she very much helped me do that recently, where I definitely had a racial unconscious bias that I did not know about. And she was so graceful and allowed me to talk to her through it. And I made a complete social media faux pas, and she was so graceful about it. And I think that I still have discomfort with it in terms of like looking in and realizing that there was something that I just was ignorant about, and having someone like her be able to talk through that and just have this really wonderful grace and understanding of realizing that people can be ignorant, but you can get through it on the other side if you can just embrace the fact that you kind of effed up, Mm-hmm. So thank you, Julia. You're the best.
Before we move on then, June, do you mind, and it might be too personal, but do you mind discussing a little bit of what that racial bias was? Because I think that's important too.
Yes, I mean, and honestly, like, Julia helped in saying this, you should keep this post up because it is very informative to people who don't understand. So it was my birthday, and someone made me an image of a shirt, and it was a 40 bottle, celebrating my 40th birthday. And I did not know that there was such a history behind that image. And so I got called out on it, rightfully so. And someone tagged Julia and was like, you should talk to her about it. And then so I emailed her and said, please do. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to bring any offense. And honestly, Julia was like, I didn't expect you to know this, but this is offensive, and now you know. And that is honestly, like, we left it up there just to be able to inform people that there are just things that we don't know, perhaps because of our backgrounds, because we never came across that. But it's important to understand where things can stand in terms of offending people, mm-hmm. and being okay to say, man, I wish I knew that, and I didn't mean to do that. And thank you for showcasing that someone can just allow that to be and to grow from there. And a lot of the people in that are in my social media feed honestly didn't know that same thing either. So I was able to.
But that goes back to grace, right? Goes back to grace. If you want to reach out to me and talk about whatever faux pas, because we all make mistakes, then that's okay. It's just we make them, we learn, and we go forward, and we don't hold that against ourselves personally, but it's just like President Obama would say, teachable moment, right? That's a teachable moment, and you'll use that going forward. That's all that really is.
Mm-hmm. It was amazing. I mean, but I'm so sorry. In regards to your question, all the time. So I have a master's degree in English, and I worked extremely hard to have whatever the equivalent of a Filipino transatlantic accent is, so that it's accentless whenever I speak. My mother grew up with, British English whenever she was in the Philippines. So it is surprising to some people that I don't have a Pan-Asian, Asian American, or whatever that actually is, because there's so many different Asian accents out there. And oftentimes in restaurants, because even though I'm an owner of the restaurant, people think I'm the host because I really love to stand at the door. Like that's the first interaction that you have with a guest. And that's part of being an owner. You see people, but oftentimes I will be referred to as that nice host lady up there,
Mm-hmm.
and you just have to say, okay, thank you. That's actually not my position.
Well, at least you don't get offended at that, because as you say, how are they supposed to know if they're just walking in and seeing somebody who's greeting them? It's just a natural thought, as opposed to a negative thought, maybe. And again, that grace, sometimes it's not always, we don't always need to be on the attack for every little thing every misstep somebody may make, because Julia, as you have said, like it may not occur to them sometimes. So I think that's something important to repeat constantly throughout this conversation. And at that, I want to also remind everybody to please throw your questions into the Q&A chat box. Don't wait till the last minute, because then we'll have just so many and we won't be able to get to them. It'll be a little bit messy, but please do post your questions into there. Ntsiki, I want to talk to you about language again, and not just in terms of, as you were talking about your university experience, but in terms of the language we use in talking about wine. And this is something you have in common with Julia, that you noticed a lot of wine talk, aromas and flavors, they use terms that maybe aren't natural to different cultures. So you've made some changes in the way you talk about wine so that people in your community can relate more, because that's kind of a barrier, that if you don't know what lychee tastes like or smells like, then it might just turn you off. So Ntsiki, can you talk a little bit about how that realization came to you and how you get around it? Because so many of these terms are just part of the dialogue.
So thank you. So I think I'll look at this back when I was a student, because the lecturers will talk about citrus, talk about all the fruits that they will talk about, which I had never tasted. And so going to a supermarket to try and smell these things, and you realize that, okay, it's something that actually most of these things I don't know. And even when I was working, people used to speak about truffles, and I had no idea what truffles were. All I could think of was chocolate. And I had to take it upon myself to find out what are truffles. But now what I ended up doing is to take, when people said a flavor of something or the character of something that I actually don't know, I'll smell it. And then generally it reminds me of something that I know. It will remind me of something that I grew up. So whenever I speak to somebody, that whoever I talk to about the wine, I'm not going to tell them about the truffle. I tell them about something that I know. I'll tell them about the calabash. I'll tell them about amasi or sour milk, whatever that I know. And so much so that I've realized that it is important, actually, even though obviously for European people, I can explain to say, yes, it's truffle. But for people in South Africa who knows all these other things, I'll say, actually, this is this, and explain it in my own understanding, in the language that I understand, in the language that a person I'm talking to will understand.
And that's something that's very culturally specific, because what will work in your culture won't work in the Filipino culture, won't work in the Indian culture, won't work in the Jamaican culture. And yet there are so many countries in the world, how do we ensure that the language of wine is inclusive? Julia, you've talked about this not only in terms of culturally, but in terms of masculine and feminine terminology. I'd also like to hear from Jancis as a wine writer, how or if this has even entered your consciousness about how wine language needs to be adjusted.
I'll chip in. I'm certainly aware that so many people, particularly men, but not just men, describing wines use gender-specific descriptions. And occasionally I'll throw in, this wine conforms to the feminine stereotype, if you like. I mean, never just saying it's a feminine wine, but sort of slightly drawing people's attention to the sort of silliness of making wine sound either female or male. But while we're discussing language, I would also say that somebody who's like me, who's been writing about the issues of race a lot recently, I do find the language more demanding and more difficult than the sentiment. It's very easy to feel the right thing, but to actually use the right terms is really difficult. I mean, Julia, we've found, haven't we, that we have different terms on either side of the Atlantic, for instance, and the language has evolved in the US, hasn't it? There are different ways of describing the same thing, different names used. So it's quite a minefield, I must say.
I think it's a constant, as wine, you have to constantly learn what is new and what needs to be said. And the reason why I know when I started in wine, I mean, really like in wine, it was the late 90s. So it was California Cab and Texas barbecue, right? And everything was like, this is a bold, masculine wine. And I'm like, well, I'm bold, but I'm not masculine. I love California Cab. And so I have decided to not use those terms or saying this is a manly style wine. You can say it goes to the feminine aesthetic, or someone might think that, but like I have guy friends who just love rosé, right? They all drink rosé all the time. So it's me trying to understand myself and my role in the world and how to learn, to be a constant student, to learn to not pigeonhole and to find another way of describing language. I mean, words, especially with wine. I was like, Ntsiki, like, I didn't know what a gooseberry was until 4 years ago. I had never had it, but everybody describes Sauvignon Blanc as a gooseberry. And I was like, well, I don't know what a gooseberry is until I just happened in the grocery store and saw a gooseberry. And I was like, oh, this makes perfect sense. But to me, a lot of Sauvignon Blancs taste like grapefruit. Right? That's where but everyone describes the gooseberry. But when I describe Sauvignon Blanc to customers in retail perspective, I tell them it tastes like a sweet tart, a really, really tart, acidic sweet tart that you get right here in the back. And that they get that more than me saying a gooseberry, because I'm assuming most of them don't know what one is, as I didn't.
Yeah, language is one of those invisible barriers on both sides in terms of the language we use inside the industry, and how it makes people outside the industry feel they're not intelligent enough sometimes, or that they're not wealthy enough to be part of this community. That wine, the world of wine, is a very, not only white, but a very elite, financially elite type of industry. Ntsiki, how did you experience that as somebody who became South Africa's first Black female winemaker? You actually lucked out. Your mentor at Stella Kaya was a real great mentor to you, and there was no discrimination there. Like you had a very good mentor who didn't see color or gender. But I'm sure in the rest of your experiences, especially opening us, Lena, that was not always the case.
So what basically used to happen, I think I used to experience this when I'm doing tastings. I think June also spoke about this, and Julia has mentioned it, but I used to experience that when I'm doing a tasting, that I'll be talking about wine, and people, they see a person working at the tasting room, and then immediately I start telling them about what's in the wine. And then the next question, how do you know this? So it's like, in other words, I'm not supposed to know this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be like, yeah, because I made the wine. And then there's that change again. And like, because obviously they did not, the picture of a winemaker, I basically I don't represent what a winemaker look like. So what they perceive a winemaker should look like and what they know a winemaker look like. So, and then immediately I say I'm a winemaker, and then there's that different reaction. So it's, I think it's one of those things where you just basically, again, go back to what Julia said, have grace. So you look on it and you like focus on something that's going to be positive, that actually somehow you're all going to be in one. I think when I started Aslina, it was actually one of those at that point where I didn't know what to expect with the local market. And with time, I realized that people were waiting for the wine. They have been waiting for the wine, and they have been waiting. When are you starting your own company? So it's been locally, they've been welcoming. Mm-hmm. They've been really excited about the wine. Obviously, again, not everybody is the same. I do meet people who've got a different view and who have a different expectation. But then it comes back to the reaction I gave.
Mm-hmm. There have been some other areas of discrimination that are not so visible, but before we get to those in terms of socioeconomic and perhaps age, well, that's visible. But Jancis, I wanted to ask you, you had brought up the issue of religion, and also you were commenting on a few sommeliers who have physical disabilities and how you tried to provide some guidance. But can you talk about that? Because physical disabilities, being in a wheelchair or being blind, there are some extra challenges, especially in parts of the world where those countries are so old, there may not be physically able to accommodate or not accessible to certain people.
Yeah, I think we were discussing, weren't we, a very ambitious young Somme who's in a wheelchair, and he was based in Italy. And, you know, the architecture of Italy is beautiful, but it doesn't tend to be very wheelchair friendly. And he's taken himself off to Australia to try and seek his fortune, just in time to Melbourne, just in time for the complete lockdown of Melbourne, poor guy. No, I did mention disability, religion, and I'm so glad you mentioned accent, because these are all other areas in which there is discrimination. They don't sort of hit the headlines, but you're keenly, you know, if you know anyone who's involved, you're keenly aware of that. And in Britain, you may imagine that accent is massive. It looks as though Julia can sympathize with that. And people, you know, if you have, I mean, I come from the north, and you know, people up there talk like that, and they're just not taken seriously because they don't sound like the received southern accent, which is terrible. And it's again, it's like missing out the entire non-white population of the world in your marketing of wine. It's stupid. You're you know, denying yourself probably, well, certainly more than half the world's population. And it's just all about inclusivity, isn't it? In one word, that's all. Mm-hmm.
Julia,
and religion as well. There's a lot of unconscious bias against various religions, which we, especially in this country, but we fight against that.
And sometimes, and I want to actually delve into that just a little bit, because sometimes religion can be visible if you're wearing a headdress or if you're wearing certain religious garb, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you only find out when you have a discussion with somebody. So Jancis, how would you say religion becomes an issue? Can you give an example of something?
Well, if you just read the classics of English literature, I mean, there is the most terrible anti-Semitic streak running through it, even from some writers that we all completely revere. But or every little reference is building up to a picture, isn't it? It's sort of fortifying people. If they did have a prejudice to begin with, it's giving them the right to continue with that prejudice.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to comment on that in terms of the religious aspect, if they've had any experience with how that might have negatively impacted somebody in the industry?
I think,
go ahead.
I think when you're talking in terms of religious effects, you find some religions, basically because a person is not allowed to drink
mm-hmm.
or to be anywhere close to wine or to alcohol. So whenever they are looking for a job within the industry, and then it's like, there is that, I think, to say, because the person is not going to be able to drink, they're not going to really put, it's just the thinking to say probably they might not put an effort to work because they don't actually, this is against them. Actually, they're working in it, that is against their religion. And you find some people actually don't have an issue with that. They, as much as the religion said they don't drink, they're not going to be drinking, but they don't have an issue with working in certain parts of, because the industry is broad. We've got lots of different sectors within the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe I could just chip in here. I was once asked to go to the Maldives to train some of the waiting staff there. It was really tough. And of course, they were mostly Muslim. And they were really keen and very good tasters. You don't have to drink to taste. And I think there was the most famous sommelier in Japan, I could have this, is a teetotaler. And there's also a famous Washington winemaker, isn't there, who doesn't drink. So, and in fact, you might argue that if you're not drinking, you maybe taste even better. So you're
mm-hmm. Julia, you wanted to comment there?
No, I know, like for the industry, like also what Ntsiki was saying, but also people who maybe can't work on Sundays, maybe religious, or they have a prayer ritual. A lot of times religion is just so personal, and our industry is hard for that to accommodate those kind of things but I also think those people, like there's parts of the industry that's not just about the drinking part, that I think gets lost in how we promote the industry.
Mm-hmm. June and Julia, I was going to ask quickly about the accent thing and maybe one type of discrimination that is based on nationalism, because I know there's a lot of anti-US sentiment around the world. So when you go to travel in Europe, do you sometimes find that impacts the way the community there, the wineries, the winemakers treat you?
I would say first, it's one of those, it's more you're an American. I think it is either they like our politics or don't. They like the president or they don't. Like it's more of a political issue.
Right.
Personally, for me, I know, like we talked about before, the different languages, Jancis, according to like where you are in, different regions of the world. I do preface when I'm there to let the people know that you can't say certain words to me, being a Black woman, and no one has had a problem with it. No one has had a problem that I've traveled and say that word in the US, and they're usually more fascinated because no one has ever told them.
What would some of those words be for you?
Well, you can't say colored. Colored in the US does not work. It works in New Zealand. It works in South Africa. It's just a different connotation. It's different around the world, right? And so I say I'm a person of color who identifies as Black. And usually most people don't even realize that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. Because in their culture, everything is colored and non-colored. And so when I have people who are really in the business that are Black and I talk to them about this, I like, okay, we have to have a discussion. If this is going to be said, how would they know our politics? How would they know about the civil rights movement in America, the slavery? They don't understand those terms. So really just having a conversation with people is so much easier than me being mad the whole time because someone said it. Instead of saying, oh, in the US, we don't, that word has negative connotations. And usually they're so sorry because they didn't know. But I do expect if I go to like New Zealand, they're going to say, oh, the colored girl. And I always go, just FYI, if you come to America, can't use that word. And you say it so nice and fun. Everybody's like, okay. It's also how I'm presenting that. If it is being angry, it's once again, grace, teachable moment. That person doesn't know. Just like I don't want to say something, like if I was going to New Zealand, I wouldn't call anybody there a Kiwi because I know that means a close relationship. You just don't say that word to people. But that's me Googling what not to say if I visit this certain region too.
Yeah, and for you as a person who's going into that community, you're not being offended at the fact that you need to learn certain things too, and hopefully they're not offended that you don't know them right away. Again, it's all about grace because we walk into different communities, into different cultures, and we need to understand that we don't know what is appropriate always in every different setting, right?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that when you're going into a different wine region, as someone who lives in the United States, you're going to learn something. And so part of that is learning about the culture. So you want to be prepared so that you can embrace the culture even more and learn as much as you can. Like wine is it's so enriched in geography and culture and artistry and day-to-day life that you would do yourself a disservice to not be able to do that. I think a lot of the issues that I've seen, a lot of it in the past has been my traveling partners that sometimes you don't get to choose, has been that's very difficult, and you try, sometimes there's this like compensation of their lack of wanting to learn more about the culture to be able to embrace that, and I've had really great experiences whenever I've gone overseas to learn about wine. And I think the biggest thing that's quite surprising is that there is more of a direct conversation, kind of like what Julia was saying, where, I mean, in the United States, people kind of like on eggshells, like, what kind of Asian are you? You just get asked, like, where are your parents from? What's your heritage? And it's very direct, and it's honestly, it's very appreciated because it comes off as quite genuine and natural.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. There is a little bit of that extra PC attitude in certain parts of the world, whereas
where are you from? You're like, Houston, Texas.
Right. And then it's like, but where are you really from? Yeah. Okay, we want to move on to questions in about 10 minutes or so. People, please, just a reminder to drop your questions into the Q&A chat box. But right now we're going to move into some ways that we can all, whether we are whether we're an employee, let's put it that way, or an employer, what are some of the things, the ways that we can help make things better? And one of those is mentorship and just being able to ask for help. But asking for help, for smart help, and the right person, knowing what you're asking of a person and how much you're asking of a person. So Ntsiki, I want to talk to you first, because for you, mentorship at your winery is a very important part of how you give back. So can you talk a little bit about how you mentor people, how you let them come into as Lena and shadow or learn about winemaking, and if you've seen that has had an impact on the community in terms of wine appreciation overall?
I think it is important as people in the industry to try and get more people in the industry, more Black people in the industry, create more inclusivity, people of diverse, to get the industry more diverse, as we basically discussing this diversity. I am involved with the Pinotage Youth Development Academy, the PYDA, where we are training young people through the value chain of the wine industry. So we're training young people who are previously disadvantaged, and they get trained, 18 to 25-year-olds, they get trained so that they are job ready, so that they can actually get into the industry. These are people, for me, who reminds me of myself, because they are around except that for them, they are around the industry, but they look at the wine industry as it's a place where they don't belong. It is something that is out there for them. They don't belong there. So they get trained. We do job placement in the industry, and then they actually start working at the tasting room or in the hospitality side of the wine industry, or even in the wineries and the vineyards. So for me, that is part of actually creating and building to say, okay, let's diversify the industry, because that's the reason I came into the industry. I was recruited to actually increase diversity in the industry. So for me, that is part of that. And to mentor people, and actually so that they can learn. Sometimes mentorship is not really about asking even question and learning. It's about seeing somebody who is doing something that you don't know about. And then you're like, I also want to do that. They are in a place where I haven't been. I also want to get there. What is it about? So getting those, and also for us in the industry to be open and know that we're going to meet these young people or older people who's going to say, help me out. But now it's about, again, it's like, help me in what? To be specific of what you are asking for. We always talk about be specific of what you're asking from the universe. You cannot just throw and say, oh yeah, I want whatever I can get. So be specific and be conscious about what you want. Because if you just ask, you're going to get anything, or you might not get anything. But being specific, you're going to get what you want. So asking the right question, and actually trying to learn things that are going to direct you to where you want to be. It's not, if you want to be on top there, you're not going to just jump and be on top, understanding that part, that it's going to start by each step to walk through the path to get where you want to get.
Mm-hmm. And June, picking up on what Ntsiki was saying about being recruited into the industry, you have made it part of your restaurant's business plan, so to speak, so part of how you approach your business to make your wine program inclusive to everybody in the restaurant, from busboys to the somms to the servers, and to really finding those people who show an interest, because sometimes you might just take a minimum wage job as a busboy because it's all you can get and you don't know anything about wine, but you have made it so that somebody might make a comment on that tasting and you'll sense their interest and you'll nurture it. So can you talk about how you're doing that as a restaurant owner, so that some of the people who are listening who may be in a position to employ people at wineries or elsewhere might think of similar ways to embrace in their own businesses?
For sure. It starts with, so in our handbook, we started with active language rather than the bare minimum. In the United States, there's something called the EEOC, Equal Opportunity Companies, and essentially it's just legal mumbo jumbo jargon that says you're not going to discriminate people for race, religion, sexual orientation, etc. And that just, my business partner is also an immigrant, and we thought that was just kind of BS because it's something that everyone does. So we really decided to have active language in our handbook and in all of our kind of endeavors for hiring and recruitment, that there is something that we want to have that higher level of standard. So the language is always about being diverse, about looking for a place where there's a platform for minorities to bring about as much inclusion as possible. And it always ends with something along the lines, I don't have it in front of me, but something on the lines of, for everyone to feel comfortable in a diverse environment. So meaning that you've got to be comfortable with other people who don't have the same goals around you. And so through that, we have that with our kitchen staff and our wine team, et cetera. So if there's ever a training session for the kitchen, the wine team, and the bus persons can be a part of it. So in our wine programs, we have educational programs twice a month. So the first half of the month is wine, the second half of the month is spirits, and everyone is allowed to go. And we ensure that there's a level of understanding that can be for someone who's introductory and just wants to get better at their job and wants to know a couple of different new vocabulary terms to be able to have better salespersonship. And then there's also as intricate as possible for those who may be pursuing certifications outside of work as well. And it's included for everybody. It's mandatory if it's part of your position. It is open to all persons in the company. And so it's wonderful to see people who are line cooks who are interested. And sure, they may be like showing up because they want to drink, but they're showing up on their day off or on their time off. And hopefully through just listening to people who are teaching, whether it be myself, our wine team, a wine maker, or someone that's outside of the company completely, to listen and to hear something and to hopefully learn something that may strike an interest in them.
And I think you brought up a point that is very interesting that we didn't really get to touch upon because, boy, that hour went by so quickly. But that you touched upon the fact that you need to talk about the wines or the spirits in language that doesn't exclude people who are just learning, who are just having their first glass of Riesling and knowing that there is something outside of Pinot Grigio. That's really something that is important, I think, for somms in restaurants or in wineries to be able to talk to people of different levels.
Well, that's our guest too. I mean, that's just me wanting to sell wine to people, right. Like it allows you to understand that everyone that's coming into your restaurant isn't studying for Master Sommelier exam. I mean, probably nobody is. And so being able to communicate that and teach that to not just the people who are adamantly studying for certifications, but to someone who busses tables but thinks that's cool, that looks fancy over there and I want to celebrate, and be able to order something like that on my day off, you're able to translate that nuance to different levels. And I think that opens up that access, which we've talked about, like that it kind of strips away the elitism to be able to feel good about teaching someone who may not have known that they wanted an interest in wine.
Right. Thanks, June. Julia, let's pick up there because you have talked about, because sometimes this can all seem overwhelming. Okay, I now realize that my restaurant, my winery, my wine agency isn't as diverse as I'd like it to be. I didn't even realize this was an issue, but now I want to make a change. How do I make a change and how fast can I do it? I think sometimes it gets overwhelming for people to want to do the right thing. So I really appreciated what you said about look at the makeup of your company and of your invitation list if you're a wine agent or a winery, and commit to change, but give yourself a timeline. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, first, one of the things I like to always tell people, it's okay to see color. Because a lot of times we like to say we don't see color. We all see color. We see hair color, we see lipstick color, we see clothing colors, but we act like we can't say that about a person's race. We see it, it's okay. That's not a problem. What we have to do is make sure we're not doing harm to a person based on that. So with your company and your list, give yourself a timeline. Everybody's doing these amazing Zoom wine educations. Go down the list and have someone check, are we really reaching out to all these different people to participate? You know how they are. Some are going to show up, some are not, like who's in the business. And I think with a lot of initiatives that are happening, I mean, we have the BAME with Jancis and Mags in the UK, people have a list now. They can say, okay, I'm doing a Zoom with this person. It's just a little effort that people have to do. It's not this hard. I keep telling people it's not really this hard. You can Google and YouTube every single thing. I mean, you can learn how to change a car battery on YouTube, but you can't Google more Black people in the business. I just don't understand. More Asians in it. I'm trying to really figure this point out. But it just takes a little effort. And with that, you have, and like I say, go down the hashtags too. Social media has great hashtags, like for Instagram, about wine profession or women in wine, if you want queers in wine, if that's what you want to look for, and you can just get a better pool. It's a lot of people out there that are really just not getting a lot of access. And that's what people want. People want access. It's not a hand out, it's a hand up. And that's easy to do. It's just not that hard.
It really is about being welcome to the table, and that's the title of this seminar, is setting the table for all women in wine, because sometimes those invitation lists are so exclusive, and it's the same people that are being invited all the time, probably who have tasted that portfolio 15 times already. So leaving some room for newcomers or new names, they might not even be newcomers to the industry, but they're just newcomers to your table, is really important. And Jancis, you've spoken about that as well. So if you want to touch upon that, and then let's get into what BAME is doing out in the UK. That mute button.
That one. Sure. You know, it all starts with Julia, as you might imagine, the most energetic person in the United States, as far as I can see. And we thought, together with Mags Janjo, who works in the UK wine trade, whom I have yet to meet, funnily enough, although we've done so much together. We're meeting up on Thursday for the first time. We saw Black Wine Professionals and thought there ought to be something like it on our side of the Atlantic. And our term, believe it or not, is BAME, B-A-M-E, which is Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic. And so ours is bamewineprofessionals.co.uk. And it's great in that we've really stirred the pot and made the UK wine trade think about the issue. They're not all evil, they just hadn't thought about it, most of them. And we've drawn in some great offers. The biggest wine retailer in the UK has offered 24 free WSET level 2 courses to between October and the end of the year. And they're swamped by applicants, and they're going to do the same thing in the spring. We've got the head, you know, there are committees formed for the WSET and the Institute of Masters of Wine and so forth. Other people at the head of big organizations are taking the issue seriously. But as you say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You know, we don't want it just to be it's this summer's issue, but then we'll go on to something else. It's got to be sustained change. So those are the good things. But the thing I'm slightly ashamed of is how few people we have. I mean, it just shows how underrepresented non-white people are in the UK wine trade. We've got some and some who have really done great things. And I know that those names are going on PR's invitation lists and things like that, which is so important. But, you know, there will always be people who just don't get it, sadly.
Yeah. And that is, in some ways, the biggest problem is if the gatekeepers don't get it, then things will never change. It is really a trickle-down effect. So seeing people who are taking up the charge and making sure that you cannot avoid that change needs to happen is really important. There are a few questions here that are similar, so I'm going to combine the couple of the ones that I see here. And that's in terms of the North American sort of bias. We've already talked about this a little bit in terms of language. So maybe not the North American, I should say the European sort of bias of language and terminology and color. So if for example, the court of, these questions are popping up so fast now, folks, it's just hard for me to keep track of them here. But in terms of the certifications and courses, the language in those courses, in those certifications, in the classes that people are taking are so ancient in terms of their terminology. How are we going to change some of that? Like, we have a panel here of amazing women who are doing work in their worlds, but if the courses that people are taking and the big organizations are not changing, how do we get some of those things, those changes to happen? How do we get that language to be a little more diverse in your WSET classes, for example? Julia, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think for some of the instruction, you know, it is VSP, it's vertical shoot positioning. We can't change what that is, right? But what it is, I think, when we're having students students also need to feel comfortable that they can speak and say, I have never had this fruit, this vegetable, this understanding. Also, looking at food and wine in terms of being ethnic food, it is just food. It is just the food that I grew up in, the food that I like. If I could pair, like, you know, let's and look at food pairings as far as where you're located, right? If someone would teach a food class on pairings and just tacos, okay, fine, right? Because somebody may not have ever had fine dining food, right? They may be coming to the industry. That's not in their wheelhouse. They don't understand that, but making it really, it's also the instructors breaking it down. So when you're explaining food, how it pairs, and ask the student, what did you grow up eating? And then it's our job as educators to really take the mantle on and decide we're going to teach. You can teach to the test, because basically that's what CMS and W said is teaching to the test in a grid, but you can also take that grid and allow people to have a little free-flowing thought process outside of teaching to the test. Like, what do you normally have with that? What do what did you grow up eating? What did you grow up drinking? What part of the country did you grow up? Tacos in Texas are different than tacos in California. And just have that dialogue, and we can take the elite part out of it if we really just started thinking about food and the people that are actually taking the classes. Yes, you might have people who are in restaurants, but if you're W set like me, I've never worked in a restaurant. I spend a lot of money eating at restaurants, and I love restaurants, and I want that industry to come back. But my reference for food is very different as it relates to how I talk with people about wine.
Right. And I thank you for bringing up the ethnic food, because I did want to touch upon that, but there's so many little things that we didn't really get to touch upon. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it is such a valid point. What is ethnic to you is not ethnic to me. And I could say the same for anybody here. So maybe taking that word and just getting rid of it when we're talking about food is a way we can all move forward and be a little bit more inclusive. It's just something so minor that we don't think about, because it's just what we grew up with, this language. But now that it's in our consciousness, maybe we can say, oh yeah, I don't need to talk about a hamburger as ethnic food, because I guess for me, a hamburger would be ethnic. So let's just get rid of that term from our lexicon. Okay, we have a question here. And the question is that BIPOC is a term being used to be more inclusive in many communities. How do we feel about this term?
I'm fine with whatever term is not offensive to people. If that term is offensive to someone and they don't want to be called a BIPOC, then you need to ask that person, how do they want to be identified? Like for me, I say BIPOC as a general, but I always say I consider myself Black. You might have another person who considers themselves African American. That's an individual thing. I think what it's trying to do is just put a spotlight on a certain group that has been so discriminated against. So I'm not against that word at all, but I think if you're wanting to know about how a certain person feels who happens to be BIPOC, ask them.
And as Jancis said, in the UK, they use the term BAME, so it's different. Ntsiki, what do they use in South Africa? You're on mute.
Actually, I don't know, because we've got Black people, and that's basically like people of color.
Is there a large audience there or population there that is not Black or white? Because I know, for example, Indians are everywhere in the world. So I know that there's a large Indian population in parts of Africa, but not so much where you are?
In Durban. So we've got a large population of Indians in Durban. But other than that, the largest population in South Africa is Black. So yeah.
I guess really BIPOC, it's a localized term that is popular in a lot of the states and Canada now, but different parts of the world use different terms, and we've all just got to have a little grace if we don't love the term of the day, because 10 years ago it was visible minority or ethnic minority. I hated that one, but grace, everybody just take a moment. Okay, Muroki is a person of color, a POC woman, and she comments that a lot of times women feel pressure to be extra polite, extra professional and articulate, and demonstrate our knowledge to prove that we stand on the same ground. Is this a game we need to continue to play in order to integrate our message to drive change?
Nope. Here's the thing. You can be kind, you can be fair, and you could get your point across. But I don't want any woman thinking their name is Boulevard or Street so people could walk over them. You have an opinion, use it. It's okay not to like things. That is okay. The key is, once again, if you can tell someone no in kindness, because also no is a complete sentence. And I think as women, that is really hard to, it goes back the way you answer an email, right? Oh, you're apologizing in an email because you maybe couldn't talk to anybody. I don't say, oh, I'm so sorry I can't meet with you. I just say, thank you for your patience. I'm glad we can figure out a time to connect. I don't apologize in emails anymore. And I think as women, we have to really, we apologize for things that we have no business doing. Mm-hmm. And also, if you know your stuff, you know your stuff. It is what it is. You don't have to, you don't have to present it. And also walk away. If there's a conversation that you're having and you feel very uncomfortable and it's not something you really want to discuss, or, people are rude to you in ways, just walk away. And just as a woman, I think we're taught to almost be like, hold back. No, it's time out for that. We're not going to change the world by that. We're not going to change the world by that.
Yeah, that's something I want to ask June about, because I think as Asian women, I'm going to put myself in that category too, there is a certain stigma, or there's a certain, people expect us to be subservient and to be, very always smiling, and maybe that's a cultural thing from Asia, from different parts of Asia and the Philippines. But have you found that in your career, that people expect you to be sort of subservient and more laid back and listen to the men talking in the room?
If so, I didn't notice it because I'm probably quite loud. So no. I mean, yeah, honestly, I think that there's just a level of comfort, and maybe it's honestly just about being comfortable with yourself. I felt uncomfortable in my own skin until probably my mid-30s. And then I just became to embrace who I am, and it's not quiet. So perhaps I'm just too loud to realize that someone expected me to be quiet, but I haven't been. And I think that it has served me well in my career, and through the Court of Master Sommeliers. I saw a couple of questions about that. So yeah, I do remain professional, and sometimes I maintain a lack of cuss words when otherwise there would be very many. So that's kind of where I hold back, but otherwise no.
Right. There is a question here. What is the role of wine certifications and courses in acting as gatekeepers of gender, race, sexuality, class, etc.? And how do we work to change this? I think we sort of touched upon that a little bit earlier. But is there anything anybody wants to add in terms of how can we work to change the way courses are done? Julie, you made a lot of comments on that. Jancis, do you have anything to add?
I would just say that I think most of these organizations are now at least aware of the issues, but they're ramified organizations, and they have lots of committees and lots of people who are involved in various ways around the world sometimes. And so we're probably being unrealistic to expect them to change like that, the way that, June could in her own empire. She's the boss, she can make it happen. I think that I know there are lots of woman hours and man hours and person hours being put into sort of sitting around tables and discussing it. And let's just hope that they actually come up with something concrete that's going to help and change things, and that is not just box ticking. But I think that it's too early, sadly, to see the results of that new awareness.
Mm-hmm. These things do take time. Sorry.
I would love to add something to that. So I agree with Jancis. So I am on the diversity committee. I'm a co-chair for the Court of Master Sommeliers in the Americas. And it is difficult because there is such a push for change immediately. And I think there's a moment where you choose. Do you want to become in a position where the current gatekeepers are and work yourself to that position so that you can open those gates? Or do you walk away from that organization? Because it's just an organization, and that probably is not what I'm supposed to say, but it is. And it's, do you work for it because you want to open those gates for people that it's been closed to? Or do you find another organization? Because in the end, they are certifications, and you can become a doctor, you can become a lawyer. We study to that test, but that doesn't make you a good doctor or a good lawyer or a good MW or a good MS. So do you continue to push because there are those people who find importance in those certifications? Because I did, like, it was important to me mostly because there are so few women. And with a certification behind my name, I felt that I would be taken more seriously. And that's kind of an unfortunate thing to think. So I think that you just have to make that decision, because the change is going to be slower than you want. It always is. But you can be part of it, or you can be part of the change in the industry in a different path, which is not a wrong thing to say if you choose not to do it.
Is there anything you can tell us about what's happening at the court in terms of diversity and inclusion?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. So I meet with the board of directors with their meetings. They're biweekly. Usually in the past, they've been quarterly. So there's definitely a more frequent platform to be able to speak. And frankly, I think what the eyes have been open to is the fact that there is a place to talk about diversity and so many different facets of the court and the certification process that it's almost like, where the hell do I start? You know, like we talked about language and testing. We've got to talk about that. We have to talk about our bylaws, and similar to how I was talking about our handbook, is it active? Is it showing that we want to move towards inclusion? Scholarship programs, mentorship programs. I mean, these are, in the grand scheme of things, younger organizations than one would think. It's just that they're older in the world of wine and certifications. So I think that seeing that there's so many facets to look towards. So we are the diversity committee, which I will be frank, historically, a diversity committee is not usually a success story. Like a company will make one, like a Nike or a Google, or big companies will hire people, and then a quarter later, they're like, cool, we fixed it. We're diverse. Diversity achieved. So it's an uphill battle, but one that we are still in, and one that we're actively in with each board meeting. So we're doing it.
You're doing it. You're going to make that diversity committee actually mean something.
No, and I mean, the diversity team they're awesome. They're amazing people.
No virtue signaling over there. There is a provocative question here from Christopher Wilton. Bear with me while I read this out. In the world of hospitality, the habit of going along to get along is particularly ingrained. To this group of women, of female firsts, often we expect those who come after us that the path we blazed and all the hard work we did, that the people coming after us should suffer as we did. Toughen up, Buttercup. I did it. However, if we expect people to have resolve, determination, resilience, to not be so easily offended, does this put the onus in the wrong place? And when does it get better? There's lots of stuff in that question. Julia, you seem ripe to answer.
The idea that we need to make it tougher on those coming behind us is not a leader, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. A leader wants to make things easier. I look at, like, if every third Monday or every time you post a photo of Martin Luther King's birthday and you do a quote and you don't make it easier for the person coming behind you, then you are the problem, not the solution. And I see this sometimes with older women are really, like, almost threatened by sometimes younger women that are coming up. Our job is to also offer them guidance in a listening, because we have that experience. Because one, we have more life experience, just in general, just being a human on the planet. And I think the idea of, yes, toughen up, but I think you can toughen up in love. I think you can say, hey, this is what I went through and this is what I'm doing, so you don't have to go through that. I think that's a cycle of women putting a woman against another woman, and that is pitting us against what's making us do our best work, is by we're doing that. And I have learned so much from, I always make the joke about millennials, right? I mean, everybody does. My job for millennials, I'm not supposed to like your music. My parents didn't like my music and I don't like yours. It's fine. But I can learn from them. I think you can learn something from every single person that you come in contact with, good or bad. But as women, we have to do a better job of reaching back and pulling those younger people who are going through up with us. So anytime somebody like really wants to talk about like writing and they reach out to me, I may not I will tell them, I don't have the bandwidth, email me in 3 months and I will get back to you, because I don't want to be the only person. I don't want to be the only person on these panels. I want somebody coming behind me who's younger, smarter, brighter, because guess what? In a few years, I don't want to be this person that's just on this panel talking about this. I don't want this panel to exist. I want to say the entire panel is like, how amazing was 5 years ago that we had this Femmes du Vin, and now 5 years later, we have so many younger women that came into this profession because we did a panel. Mm-hmm. We had the difficult conversation, and to teach them to go to be strong and powerful with grace and dignity. That's what we need to do. It's not that, toughen up. It's like, no, our job is to pull them up.
I want to flip that around now quickly for Jancis before I get to the last question that I think is a really important one. Jancis, when we're talking about younger women, and obviously we don't want to make it as hard for them. We want to impart our wisdom and our experiences to hopefully make their path a little bit easier so that they can, again, pay it forward. But do you find on the flip side that sometimes those younger women come in and they're not open to hearing your experiences or to listening, that they just have a way of thinking that they know everything? And how do you deal with that when you're trying to make things better for the next generation?
I suppose if a young woman doesn't think I'm worth listening to, she won't approach me and ask for any advice. So I'm in blissful ignorance of anyone who doesn't want to listen to me. As a writer, I'm in a slightly different position, say, to June, who's out there and with a team. I spend most of my day, especially at the moment in the pandemic, here. I went, even going out to tastings is very rare nowadays because of the restrictions. So for people to get in touch with me, they more or less have to email me or message me. So they have to make a conscious effort, really. But I mean, there are lots of great young women, and I just feel so flattered that there are so many young people of all sorts, not just women, who see a career in wine as something really great and desirable. And all the people I see who have been successful bankers or executives in a row who do a WSET course and then decide they're going to give it all up and go into wine is amazing and lovely. And if I just tell you that when I graduated, it was so long ago, in 1971, I knew that wine and food were the things that I was most interested in, and I didn't dare tell my fellow students that I was going to try and find a job in either of them, because they would have said, what a waste of a good education, because then wine and food had no social status whatsoever. They were seen as utterly frivolous subjects. So how times have changed.
True enough. I have one final question here, and I know we're facing the clock here, but I think this is a really important question from Charlotte Big Canoe. And her question is, sometimes I struggle with negative feelings about hospitality and wine as an Indigenous woman in North America. A large part of my job is spent focusing and educating myself on Eurocentric food ideals, and wine knowledge, etc., which feels like I'm valuing assimilation in myself. Are these feelings something you have experienced? And if so, how do you balance that with having such a love for the industry? How do you remind yourself that you matter in this space and that your representation is important, even when it's so hard? Ntsiki, can we go to you first?
Yes. I think that struggle, especially when it comes to trying to look at the food and the wine to see if what you are doing is actually fulfilling for you. It's, for me, I can compare with when I started doing the food and wine pairings. I remember that it came to a point, some of the chefs, I remember, like Philip, we started using amadumbe, which is one of my traditional meals. And I was like, we're going to need to infuse and include certain types of food that speaks to me, certain types of food that I understand, so that actually, because those flavors is something that I can speak about and proudly stand with it. So I think the person who just asked that question, I think it is important to just get that confidence in yourself to say, you know what, this is who I am, and that's what makes you unique. And that's what makes you who you are. And actually, that's what's going to give you a strong point of whatever you're trying to do, because you're talking about something that you know, something that is engraved in you, something that's in your veins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ntsiki. June, how about you?
Man, I mean, Ntsiki killed it. I think it's kind of understanding your industry and the history behind it. I don't think that you should find shame in assimilation in terms of understanding that this is where part of the wine and food and hospitality industry started in Europe. French cuisine, Italian cuisine, etc. But also being able to embrace where you stand and how that affects you, and not losing the identity of the fact that you are changing the hospitality industry by being a part of it. So having reverence for history, but having the strength of being part of the future is being able to reconcile the two.
Mm-hmm. And how amazing it would be for Charlotte eventually, if she's the somm at a restaurant, to be able to talk about matching wine with indigenous foods, because nobody's doing that right now. So there's that in terms of know your uniqueness and how you can bring that to the industry. It would be just amazing. I want to thank all of you ladies for participating, all our attendees for joining. I want to remind you that all the funds you have donated to be part of these sessions go into our scholarship fund to help women around the world to have access to courses or to travel. We are really wanting those scholarships to be accessible for people other than just sommeliers. So whether you might be interested in becoming a wine agent or a wine writer or a wine what else is there? A person on the floor, a wine agency. There's so many ways. A wine judge. Thank you so much for all of you. You can donate anytime at the femduvin.org website. And to the ladies for taking time out of your very busy days and imparting on us all your wisdom. It's been such a pleasure to listen to you all. It's been incredible. Once again, these are our hashtags and our handles. We can continue this conversation on our Instagram page because I know that there are lots of questions that will continue to come in. And this is not a seminar where we have solved the problem. So let's continue to have these conversations, and hopefully, yes, as Julia said, in 5 years' time, we will look back and say, hey, remember that amazing seminar we did? Look at all the change that's happened since then. So thank you so much, ladies. Thank you to everybody who attended. And we will see you back here at 2 p.m. for our session on natural wines. And please visit our website. We've got 4 more weeks of amazing speakers and amazing topics for you all. So thanks again.